It wasn't the thunder that woke him. It was the sound of splintering wood, deep, long, like a wounded animal crying out from the dark. Jack Brodie sat up in his chair, the kind that creaks just enough to remind him he's not as young as he used to be. The fire had gone low. Outside, the storm was still rolling heavy across the hills of western Pennsylvania. He grabbed the old flashlight from the shelf and walked to the porch. Rain tapped the tin roof in uneven rhythm. But what caught his eye was what used to be standing at the edge of his yard. The oak tree, God, that oak, had finally come down. It had been there since before his father was born, thick like a cathedral pillar. For over 70 years, Jack had watched it grow. And tonight, it laid there, split wide like a broken rib cage, its roots clawing helplessly at the night sky. He didn't say a word, just stood there, wet slippers on wooden planks, staring. Jack hadn't touched his carving tools in nearly 5 years, not since Maria passed. But something about the way that tree fell, it felt personal, like an invitation. He walked into the workshop the next morning. The tools were still where he left them, covered in a thin skin of dust, like time itself had been waiting. The handle of his favorite chisel was cracked, but his hand still remembered the grip. Muscle memory. Some things never leave you. By noon, the chainsaw roared. He didn't cut for firewood. He cut for something else. He didn't know what he was carving yet. But the moment the blade touched that oak, he felt it. That quiet space in his chest, the one hollowed out since Maria's funeral, stirred. And in that moment, he wasn't carving wood. He was carving his way back to life. The smell used to be different in here. Back when Maria would leave a fresh pot of coffee on the bench by the door. Back when sunlight still hit the windows at just the right angle, making the dust in the air glow like it had something to say. Jack's workshop wasn't just a place to make things. It was where he remembered how to feel. The walls were lined with tools passed down from his father and his father before him, each with its own wear, its own groove, a history carved in calluses and time. There was a lathe from 1942, still working, a bench vise older than Jack himself, a drawer full of nails that no longer fit anything, but he couldn't throw away. He used to come out here every day, not to sell anything, just to be with the wood, to listen, to shape. He carved toys for his grandson before the boy moved away, frames for Maria's garden photos. He once spent 3 months on a single rocking chair, the one she used in the evenings, wrapped in a blanket, book in her lap, lamp behind her shoulder. He hadn't set foot in here since the funeral. She was the reason he carved. And when she was gone, so was the rhythm, the urge, the point. People told him to stay busy. That time would help. But time doesn't know what to do with silence. And Jack had grown used to the silence. Until that tree fell. Now he was staring at a stump the size of a tractor tire and a slab of oak longer than his workbench. Something inside him had shifted that night, something that didn't want to be still anymore. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew. This one's for her, not a gravestone, not a tribute. It's something real, something alive, and maybe, just maybe, something that could hold the parts of him he thought he'd lost. The morning was quiet, too quiet. No radio, no birds, just the creak of old hinges as Jack opened the barn doors and wheeled the slab of oak into place. It took him nearly half an hour to steady it. His knees weren't what they used to be. But once the log was anchored, he stood there for a while, staring. The surface was uneven, split near the center, sap still weeping from the grain. He didn't know what shape it would take yet, but his hands, they moved on their own. He picked up the mallet, the same one he used to fix the front porch in '78. Same crack down the handle, same grip that fit his palm like an old friend. And then, crack, tap, chip. The first few strikes were awkward, like learning to walk again. But the rhythm came back faster than he expected. There was no plan, no sketch, just memory. A ridge of the oak reminded him of Maria's shoulder when she'd lean against the window. A knot in the wood curved just like the lines of her cheek when she smiled without meaning to. He began shaping what looked like a jaw. Not hers, not human either. Something ancient, powerful, guarded. A dragon, maybe, but not the kind from fairy tales. This one wouldn't breathe fire. It would hold sorrow and protect what was left behind. With every chip of wood that fell to the floor, Jack felt a little lighter. Not happy, not healed, but less trapped. And for the first time in years, his hands weren't shaking from age. They were steady from purpose. He didn't need to finish it all today. He just needed to begin. The dust swirled in beams of soft light, drifting like old ghosts through the workshop. Jack wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of sap across his temple. The dragon's jaw was forming, sharp, strong, tense, but not angry. Not yet. Each stroke of the chisel opened something deeper than wood. It wasn't just grain he was uncovering, it was memory. He remembered the first time Maria saw him carving, back in '69. They were still young. He'd brought her to the shop just to show her how to plane a board, and she'd smiled at how serious he got. "You talk to the wood like it's alive," she said. "It is," he'd replied. "You just have to listen." She never forgot that line. And now, neither did he. The smell of the oak was different today. Earthy, rich. It smelled like the forests near Camp Pendleton, where he trained before being deployed. Jack hadn't spoken about the war in years, but the shape of the wood, its resistance, the sound it made when cut, brought it all back. The men, the sand, the silence after. He never carved during the war, only after. It was Maria who bought him his first proper gouge, after his second panic attack, after the nightmares started. She never asked him to talk. She just handed him a piece of cedar and said, "Do what your hands remember." And they did. Now, with every tap of the mallet, those years came pouring through the blade, not to torment, but to be released. Jack paused, set the tool down. He ran his fingers over the unfinished mouth of the dragon. There it was, a small curve in the lip, almost like a smirk. Maria used to smirk like that when he got too serious. He smiled, only a little. Then he picked the chisel back up and kept carving. Not because it hurt, but because it finally didn't. It started with a twitch, barely noticeable at first, just a small tremor in Jack's right thumb. He ignored it, kept carving. But within the hour, the tremor had spread to 2 fingers. By mid-afternoon, the gouge slipped. Not dangerously, not deep, just enough to leave a scratch across the dragon's left cheek, breaking the clean flow he'd spent hours perfecting. He stared at it for a long time, put the tool down, backed away from the bench. His breath was shallow now, sharp around the edges. He knew what this was. The doctor had called it essential tremor. Benign, they said. Just age, just nerves. It wouldn't kill him, just take pieces of him away. Jack sat on the old stool in the corner of the shop, the one Maria used to perch on while pretending to supervise. His hands rested in his lap, still shaking. Not violently, but enough to make carving impossible that day. And with the tremor came the voices, the quiet, cruel kind. You waited too long. It's too late to make something worth keeping. This won't bring her back. He closed his eyes. He could almost hear Maria's voice, but not the calm one from the garden. This was her hospital voice, faint, worn thin. She'd held his hand then, even when his had been steady. And now, his strongest tool was starting to fail him. He looked at the dragon again. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even fierce anymore. It looked tired, just like him. He reached out and ran his fingers over the scratch. It could be sanded. Maybe. Maybe not. But maybe it didn't need to be perfect. Maybe neither did he. Still, he turned off the lights that night without carving another stroke. For the first time since the oak fell, the shop was quiet again. But not hollow. Not yet. It was 2 days before Jack opened the shop door again. The air inside was stale, like it had been holding its breath, waiting. He didn't bring tools right away, just coffee. The same mug Maria had given him for his 50th birthday. It had a chip on the rim now, but he still drank from the other side. He walked over to the dragon. The wood had dried slightly, less sap, more tone. The scratch was still there on the left cheek, jagged, honest. Jack didn't try to fix it. Instead, he sat across from the sculpture and looked at it like he was meeting an old friend again after years apart. "You're not broken," he murmured. "Neither am I." His hands were still trembling, so he worked slower, much slower. He learned to breathe with each stroke. Inhale, position, exhale, press. It wasn't about speed anymore. It was about listening. The wings came next, wide and arched, like they were ready to rise but not quite fly. He carved each feather with care, leaving some slightly uneven, on purpose. Because Maria had once said, "Symmetry is boring. Life's a little crooked, and that's what makes it yours." By midweek, the tremor hadn't gone away. But Jack had stopped seeing it as the enemy. He just adjusted. New grip, softer pressure, less force. He even began using his left hand more. It wasn't as precise, but it had something different, something gentler. The dragon changed, too. It no longer looked fierce. It looked wise, like it had been through things, but stood anyway. By Friday, Jack had carved a ridge down the spine. Then the claws. Then the eye. The eye was everything. He spent 3 hours on just that, because he wasn't carving an animal anymore. He was carving something that watched over pain without fear, that stood guard over grief without trying to erase it. And when he finally stepped back, covered in dust and sore as hell. He smiled. Not a big smile, but the kind that settles quietly in the chest, like a hand on the shoulder that says, "You're doing all right." He didn't plan the last day. There was no finish line, no grand reveal, just one more morning, one more cup of coffee, and one more pass of the carving knife. But somewhere between shaping the last horn and smoothing the final scale, he felt it. Stillness, not silence, not absence, but the kind of stillness that settles in when a thing has become whole. Jack set the knife down slowly, backed away from the dragon. It towered over the bench, wide wings outstretched, claws coiled under a chest, carved from centuries-old oak. The face was powerful, yes, but kind. The scratch on its cheek was still there. He hadn't sanded it. He never would. He lit the shop lamp just above the head, warm yellow light spilling down like morning sun, and stared. It didn't feel like something he had made. It felt like something that had been waiting to be revealed. And his hands, old, rough, imperfect hands, had simply helped it get here. Jack didn't cry. That wasn't his way. But he stood there for a long time, hat pressed to his chest, breath quiet and full. For years he'd thought carving was a craft. Now he knew better. It was prayer. Not the kind you say out loud, the kind you say with wood, with patience, with the decision to stay when everything else says leave. He named it the Watcher. Didn't carve that into it, just whispered it once and let it be. He didn't post a photo, didn't sell it. He placed it on a wooden pedestal just inside the barn doors, where the sun would hit it at 4:17 p.m., the exact time Maria used to call him in for supper. He didn't expect visitors, but they came. A neighbor, then a niece, then someone's grandson who loved dragons and didn't want to leave. Jack didn't need to explain it. The dragon stood there quietly, and it spoke for him. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. We'd love to know what you saw in Jack's dragon, or in the dust of your own memories. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. We're just getting started. Next time, we'll tell the story of a father in Arizona and the wooden flag he built after losing his son in service. Different hands, same heart. Until then, stay steady, stay kind, and keep carving.